Hi, everyone. My name is Nina, and I'm so excited to be able to speak today at Product School. Thank you for having me or for spending this next little bit of time with me. And my talk today is called The One-Shot Product, and it's about how we approach building products when we only have one chance to get it right. So like I said, my name is Nina. I'm currently at Microsoft. Before Microsoft, I was a product manager at this great company called Xamarin, which built mobile development tools. And in my professional life, I jump around a lot between product and engineering because I have no attention span and things are interesting on both sides. So I really have a foot in both worlds. And the part of my career that I wanted to draw from today in talking to you is a year that I spent working as a product manager on Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign in 2019 to 2020. So for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth Warren is the senior senator from my state of Massachusetts. And last year she ran for president. And one of the reasons I wanted to touch on, or there's two reasons I wanted to touch on problems from that space. One is that I'm hoping that at least some of you are interested in taking your career in the direction of working on campaigns or any civic or political tech. It's a very interesting space. There's a lot of hard problems and it's a lot of fun. So if anything in here speaks to you, know that that is a path that you can take your career in. And second, I encountered problems in that space that I haven't encountered elsewhere in my in previous work that I've done that I think are really interesting. And so that's one of the problems that I'm going to talk to you about today. Specifically, in the past, in past jobs that I've had, there were a lot of systems in place to minimize risk when shipping products, both on the technical side and the product side. And these were things that we didn't have, and sometimes things that we didn't, the situations wouldn't allow us to really implement some of the best practices. And the scenario that I'm going to talk to you today is one of those. So I'm hoping that'll be interesting and something new for you folks to consider. All right, so the story I'm going to tell you about today. This is the product side story of how the Warren campaign tech team approached building technology for the 2020 Iowa caucuses. And I say product side because we are lucky enough to have another talk about this topic from a member of my team, an engineer on the team, who really takes a deeper dive into some of the technical aspects of the work that we did, and talks about some of the problems we encountered, and also dives into some of the caucus math, which I'll touch on as well. But I see that the fact that exists gives me the luxury to really focus on the product side and tell the story of what I did as a product manager for the app versus trying to get too technical. So I hope that you go watch John Jandak's talk as well. And together we have created an hour of wholesome Iowa caucus content for you. So please enjoy and please go check that out. All right, so let's set the stage for you. Imagine that you are a brand new product manager joining your first campaign, and the team on the campaign that is in charge of organizing for the entire state of Iowa reaches out to you and says, we need you and your team to build an app for the Iowa caucus. And you're probably thinking to yourself, what is an Iowa caucus? And they patiently explain that an Iowa caucus is going to be the very first contest that our candidate's going to be in. And it's going to be unlike other elections that you know, where you go and fill in a ballot. It's going to be in person. People are going to show up on the first Monday in February. It's going to be cold. It's going to be dark. They're going to be in an auditorium or a gym somewhere in their neighborhood with all their neighbors, moving around the room, trying to convince other people to vote for their favorite candidate. And it's going to be chaotic. And on top of all of this, there's this complex math that needs to happen to figure out how many delegates, or you can think of them as points, each candidate gets. And this process is going to repeat itself like 1,600 times across every precinct in Iowa. And from there, somehow we're going to know who won the state of Iowa. So let's say you're listening to this and you get this summary, and Maybe you're a little bit like me and you think to yourself, well, okay, there's a lot going on in the room and it's a specific use case, but I've built mobile apps before. I understand how to build a calculator. I know that there's going to be some edge cases, but really, like, how hard can this be? Well, the answer to that is pretty darn hard. I leave this here because for folks who were paying attention to the news at all last year around the time of the caucuses, you might remember that the results of the caucuses were pretty severely delayed due to a technical issue in not our app, but the official Iowa caucus app from the Democratic Party. This was really due to a systemic failure and not really something that I'm going to dive into too much here. But I really think that any technical folks or product managers especially should go read about this and study this use case because it's fascinating. There's a lot behind it, and it's just absolutely worth understanding what went wrong here. However, this is not what we're going to talk about today. This is, again, not our caucus app. This was our caucus app. So the difference here is we were building something internal. So while that was an app for reporting the official results, and that's what you had to use to get official results, on our end, this was just for us and our volunteers and our staff. So definitely much smaller scope here. And so my initial instinct when hearing about this app was close to what we needed. We were asked to design a fancy calculator with some complex math that would help Warren supporters who are in these rooms and these auditoriums in Iowa with the caucus math, so we can get results from that and understand how our candidate is doing. But more importantly, they can focus on convincing their friends and neighbors to come over into their corner and not sitting there with a pen and paper trying to write out complex caucus math equations. And so we had, like I mentioned, slightly different requirements than the official app. We had an easier ask in many ways. And the primary one is that we didn't have to worry as much about security, and we didn't have to worry too much about results accuracy. It just had to be good enough. We were not the official app. That said, we did share, because we were trying to solve a similar problem, we did share a lot of the same requirements, which we did have to meet. And the main one that I learned about was that the app really had to work offline, and it had to work very well. Parts of Iowa are very rural, and in fact, there's some areas that it's hard to even receive text messages or calls. So it had to be self-sufficient without a connection. We knew a little bit about our volunteers, so we knew that the UX had to be very accessible to users of all ages and supporters of all ages. It had to work on a multitude of devices, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that was new for me and made this a unique challenge was that the app had to work very well the first time for a one-time event. And this was different than work I had done in the past, because in the past, my instinct as a product manager had always been to try to de-risk things by rolling them out slowly. So, you have your preview, you have your alpha, you have your beta, you have your maybe small focus groups, you have when you ship something, you can immediately iterate and improve on it over time. And that was a luxury that we really didn't have. So I had to get creative about how I approached this. And I wanted to share some of the things that worked and didn't work for me, and hopefully set you up for success with your own journey through these kinds of problems. So with that in mind, here's the things that worked for me. And here's how we're going to break up the rest of the talk. First, I learned that I had to minimize my unknowns. So that was, I knew I had to test the hypothesis early, things like that. But I also started talking to, I trusted the people who had done caucuses in the past. And I worked really hard to think about what the risks were that we're willing to take and the risks that we're not willing to take. And I'll dive into that in a little bit. Second, you're only as good as your worst test case. You have to test everything. Kind of obvious, but I'll talk more about what we did specifically. And finally, having a fallback plan for your fallback plan. Gist of it is things are going to fail and you're going to have to be ready for it. And there's a couple tricks you can have in your back pocket for that situation. All right, so these are the three. Let's dive into the first one. So minimizing unknowns. How does a product manager who has never been to a caucus approach building an app for the Iowa caucuses? To be honest, I just researched the heck out of it. I spent 2 weeks just steeped in everything Iowa caucus related. I found podcasts, I found books. I printed out a copy of the Iowa delegate selection plan from the Iowa Democratic Party, which had examples, test cases of how the math works, and other things that were useful about the caucus. And I just carried that around with me everywhere. Elizabeth Warren found it on my desk one day and commented on it, so that was fun. And lastly, the thing that I leveraged, I think, the most was team members who had actually done this and who had caucused, and all the conversations that I had with those people who ended up being incredibly valuable and were willing to give me the time. That picture is a lie because nobody is that happy about talking about caucuses because caucuses are literally the worst. But these folks were very valuable to me, like I said, partly because some people who had been on previous campaigns actually had training documents for previous caucus apps, so it had screenshots. And also I found the official 2016 caucus app screenshots as well. And those by themselves were not super valuable, but having those screenshots and putting them in front of people who had used those apps was very valuable because they could immediately say, oh, I really like this, or please don't do this, this didn't work, and we don't want to do that again. And so from there, I was able to figure out or to tease out what had worked in the past and what kinds of problems we still had. And so here's kind of a rough idea of the list that I came up with at the end of my research. So there were a number of things that we kept that we liked from previous iterations of caucus apps. So we liked simple design with large buttons. We knew how to work offline. A wonderful feature that somebody suggested was the ability to take a picture of a paper worksheet. And I'd never been in a caucus. I had no idea why this would be valuable at that point, but I trusted that the person who suggested it did. And we ended up incorporating it, and it ended up being extremely valuable. On the other hand, on the other side were the risks that I felt were worth taking, and some of those were adding a map, simplifying the authentication process. Those I felt really comfortable with. But a big risk that we took was moving away from traditional mobile apps, so your iOS or Android app, to something called a progressive web app, which is leveraging web technology on a mobile device with the ability to run offline, which was incredibly important to us. So this was something that had never been tried in a caucus before, and I considered this a high risk decision to try it. But there were definite benefits from it and promises that came with it. For example, being able to avoid the app stores that my team and I felt were going to make the risk worth it. And so what you'll notice here is that the list on the left is much larger than the list on the right. So the things that we kept is much longer than the things that we were willing to take risks on. And this allowed us to stay sane and really leverage existing knowledge and not try to reinvent the wheel. So that's minimizing your unknowns. Okay, next thing. You've come up with a plan, you've built your app with the team, you've iterated with your designers and engineers, and now you have something that you might be ready to start using. What do you do next? So here's where testing comes in, and we tested a lot. We used your traditional unit testing and end-to-end testing for the code itself. We also had 10 million random test cases for the caucus math because we needed to make sure we got that right. Apart from that, I ran an internal test with volunteers from our headquarters and I lured them with prizes, which works very well. And this was just to get folks using the app and testing out that when we sent data to the database, that it was there and that we were collecting things. They sent us fun pictures, and it was good. It was just like making sure that every time we made a change, that things still worked when regular humans used them. And they did find some bugs that were valuable. We came up with a list of failure scenarios. So what happens if this piece breaks? And that was held true for the app, but also for all of the data flows that we have. So for the path that the data had to take to come from the app and into the hands of analysts who are going to look at it, we wanted to make sure that every step along the way we were ready if anything broke. So that was important to us. And then the last piece is the team in Iowa did a lot of testing on their end with volunteers. So they scheduled a training for volunteers 2 months before the caucus, making sure, and the idea there was to actually get the app into people's hands, but also to get it on their devices, pinned and ready to go. And finally, they did these things called dry runs, which are like rehearsals of the caucus, and caucus day and all the canvassing you have to do, as well as the actual caucusing. And they did this, so this is with volunteers, and they did this in the days leading up to the contest, and that also required people to use the app. So we caught some bugs there as well. So having done all of this testing and preparation and making sure we understood every edge case, we felt reasonably good going into this thing. So here's where my last piece of advice comes in. Have a fallback plan for your fallback plan. So remember at the beginning when I said that one of the biggest risks that we agreed to take was to use progressive web apps, a technology that hasn't been tried before in the caucuses, as the technology behind our app. And the thing is that progressive web apps were a great choice for this scenario, and I still feel strongly that we did the right thing. We avoided a lot of issues that I already knew about with the other options. But there was something that we weren't quite ready for. There's a component of progressive web apps called service workers that didn't work exactly the way we expected. And you don't need to know the full technical details of this, or if you want to, you can go check out John Jandok's talk. But for our purposes, basically what happened is, remember when I said that we had trained volunteers about 2 months ahead of the caucuses and gotten the app onto their device? Well, that was great preparation on our part. Unfortunately, those volunteers ended up stuck with a version of the app that was a little bit older than the one that we wanted them to have going into the caucuses. And this meant that they weren't getting the latest updates to the math, as well as some other very important things. So we had to make sure, a couple days before the caucus, that all of these users had the latest version of the app. And because service workers weren't working the way we expected, it was actually the update functionality that was broken. So here's where everything kicked into gear. We came up with a plan for how we're going to handle it and get all those users onto the latest version of the app. So first, the team discovers that service workers the caching wasn't working as we expected. And the engineers and the organizers on the ground created a guide for how to work around this. And that involved clearing the cache on a mobile device, which not everybody knows how to do, especially some of the types of users that we were getting for this app. So the engineering teams mobilized to fix the issue. We had folks on the back end who were making sure that users who were using outdated math, that their data would go to a different database than the users who were using the newest math, so that we actually had results that we could rely on. So they put that in place. And then on the front end, there was already a fix in place for how to ensure that users were always able to get updates once they had updated to this new version. So, but really the part of this whole plan that made all of this work and made all of these fixes viable were the people at the kind of last couple steps who were able to connect with the users of the app and make sure that they had the resources they need going into the caucus. So these were the organizers on the ground in Iowa who were calling up their volunteers and sending emails and contacting them multiple times from this group to make sure that they had everything they needed. And the other thing we put in place was a hotline that any of our volunteers could call to have somebody walk them through clearing their cache, or if they had any other questions about the caucus. And really what this shows to me is that you cannot overstate the importance of a good support team, especially in cases like this. This was our ultimate fallback plan. And the good news is that it worked. This is an experience from one of our users that we found later on Twitter. And it seemed like it was not ideal, it was not exactly what we wanted, but it was the best possible outcome. And luckily, we were able to get some really good feedback from users and from the media about our app, saying that we had gotten delegates because of the app, that we had been the only one in the room that worked. And then finally, my favorite thing to come out of this was, if you remember, I mentioned that we had users upload pictures of the paper worksheets. The nice thing about that is that counted as raw data for the caucus, and we were able to hand that information over to the Iowa Democratic Party and actually speed up some of the results and the release of the results of the Iowa caucuses. That to me felt great because we weren't just helping our candidate and our campaign, but we really were helping save democracy in a critical moment with this little Iowa caucus view app that we built. So pretty cool stuff. Okay, so in summary, here's the things that I found useful when trying to build a product where I only had one shot to get it right. First, I worked to minimize my unknowns. So this is testing out my hypotheses, making sure that I find and trust the experts that I talk to and don't try to reinvent the wheel. And if you remember that table that I showed you with a list of all of the things that we were keeping because they worked before, and then a smaller list of risks that we were willing to take, this is important. Make sure you make that table, make sure you understand the risks that you're taking, make sure the trade-off from those risks is worth it for you and for the product that you're trying to build. Okay, second, you're only as good as your worst test case. Make sure you are testing the code, unit test, end-to-end tests, find creative ways to validate every part of what you're doing and get it in front of users like we did with training and with putting in the hands of people in the office. Just test it out in every possible way that you can. And then finally, know that no matter how hard you test it, you will probably experience a failure of some sort, and have a fallback plan for that situation. Remember, you can always have that last layer of people and support, and you don't have to rely on technology to handle every part of this for you. And if I could leave you with just one more thought, which is where I get to say something that sounds a lot smarter than it actually is. When failure is not an option, you should treat it as the expectation. So what do I mean by that? We work in technology, and technology is going to surprise us, and it's going to break in ways that we can't even imagine, and we're going to have to deal with it in that moment. And that's why I think as an industry, we've developed all of these approaches that effectively de-risk the type of work that we're doing. So we try to not put ourselves into situations like this where we have kind of one shot to get it right. And this is where you get your previews, your MVPs, your beta releases, your even things like CI/CD will fall into the category of like, how can we make changes incrementally? How can we not have these big releases where we're really putting a lot on the line and taking a big risk? But if you do find yourself in these situations, you should plan for things to fail. So don't pray for things to work, plan for them to fail, and know that the resiliency that you want to have with your product comes from being able to handle failure and be prepared to handle the kinds of failure you're going to expect when it happens. So set yourself up for failure, and you'll have I think a better experience for your users. Okay, and one last thing. We worked really hard to open source all the code for our Iowa caucus app, and you should go check it out and play with it and see what you think. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I am so grateful to be able to do this. And if you have questions or just want to connect, you can find me on Twitter and GitHub. Yeah, happy building.